This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can pre-order every card in this set review by going to cardkingdom.com/needsahone or by following the link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Needsahone, and today I'm continuing with my Brothers War Limited set review. So far we've looked at all the multicolored, colorless, and white cards, and today we're continuing with blue. In these videos, I discuss how good I think these new cards are going to be in the new limited format. I use a letter grade system with some of my thoughts on each of these cards, and if you aren't sure what those letter grades mean, check out the description where you'll find an explanation. Before we take a look at the first blue card, a few reminders. This review is about limited in the new format. That means draft and sealed. That means I'm only going to be reviewing cards that appear in draft boosters. Also keep in mind that these are my feelings about these cards before actually playing the new format, and that means I'm definitely not going to be perfect in my predictions. After all, every format is different. As I play this one, I'll be providing updates about the format on the channel. Alright, with all of that out of the way, let's dive into the review. First up, it's Air Marshal, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 human soldier at common. You can pay 3 generic and target soldier gains flying until end of turn. 3 mana is kind of a lot to give flying only to a creature with a particular type, but the good news is that it's easier than normal to produce mana to pay for abilities in this set thanks to Power Stones, and there's also a lot of soldiers. It can of course also just target itself. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Curate, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant. It says Surveil 2, draw a card. This lets you see up to 3 cards and can let you put advantageous cards in the graveyard, and that's pretty nice, especially in a format with a spell deck where anytime you can play a non-creature spell that replaces itself, you're pretty happy to do it because you may draw more cards that let you trigger your prowess and stuff. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Defabricate, which for 1 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant. It says choose one, counter target artifact or enchantment spell. If a spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard, counter target activated or triggered ability. This set might have a lot of artifacts and enchantments in it, especially artifacts, but I'm still thinking this is a bit too narrow to be good in your main deck. You might be thinking, but yesterday you said Disenchant was good enough, and that's true, but there's a big difference between this and Disenchant. With Disenchant, you can draw it and use it to deal with an artifact or enchantment already in play. With this, you have to have your mana ready to go at the exact right time, and that's a much more narrow window. It can counter activated or triggered abilities, which does give it some additional uses, but it's often hard to get a full card back when you counter one of those. I think this is sideboard material that you only bring in against the most artifacty of decks. I think it's a D in your main deck and a C out of your sideboard. Next up, it's Desynchronize, which for 4 generic and a blue is a common instant. It says target non-land permanent's owner puts it on top or bottom of their library, scry 2. 5 mana is a lot, and while this does let you trade 1 for 1, since it doesn't just bounce the permanent, it puts it on top or bottom of your opponent's library, and by the way, they get to choose, but it also doesn't do a great job of dealing with some really problematic permanents which your opponent can just draw again. Scry 2 helps some because it makes sure that you're going to have a good couple of draws coming up, but I think this is just a C. Next up, it's Draftna, founder of Latinum, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 legendary human artificer advisor at rare. You can pay 1 generic and a blue to return an artifact you control to its owner's hand, and you can pay 3 generic and tap it to copy target artifact spell you control. This has passable base stats and a couple of nice abilities that work well together. You can use the first ability to bounce an artifact to your hand, and then on the next turn make a copy of that artifact when you cast it again. You can of course just avoid ever returning an artifact to your hand, and just copy artifacts you cast in general. Now all of this is pretty mana intensive, but in the late game, Draftna is going to do stuff that really wins you the game, and it's also fine on turn 2. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Falaji Archaeologist, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 0/3 human scout at common. When it enters the battlefield, you mill 3 cards. You may put a non-creature, non-land card from among the cards milled this way into your hand. If you don't, put a +1/+1 counter on the Archaeologist. This is a cool design. It'll either be a 2 mana 1/4, which is passable, or a 2 mana 0/3 that gets you something back from the graveyard. Now, keep in mind you only get the card back if it's among those that are milled, and this only hits non-creature, non-lands, so you may whiff sometimes. But if you're a spell-heavy deck in this format, like Blue-Red will be, it seems like this will do what you want it to most of the time, and at least you get a consolation prize if you do whiff. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Flow of Knowledge, which for 4 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant. It says draw a card for each island you control, then discard 2 cards. I don't love this card. It kind of wants you to be pretty close to mono blue. If you cast this with 3 islands in play, which will be a pretty common occurrence in your typical 2-color limited deck, you're not really going to be happy with what you get. By the later game, it's likely to do a little better, but because you have to discard 2, you probably need to be drawing at least 4 with this consistently, and even that doesn't feel amazing. I think this is probably a D+ in your typical blue deck in the format, but in a deck that has 10 or 12 islands, it's probably a C+. It is nice that it triggers spell payoffs and it triggers the various payoffs for the blue-black deck, which is interested in drawing multiple cards. But I just think it's going to be hard to get back enough value with this card for it to feel great. Next up, it's Forging the Anchor, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon sorcery. It says look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal any number of artifact cards from among them and put the revealed cards into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. It seems like this is going to be divination a lot of the time, and a divination that you have to do some serious work with in order to actually draw those 2 cards. You can hit more than 2 things with this, and that will feel significantly better, and that is a possibility. This is an artifact-heavy set. But the flip side of hitting 0 to 1 things is definitely real. Obviously, you can run a bunch of artifacts, but I think the average outcome with this is probably something like 1.8 cards, which is actually worse than divination. 5 deep just isn't deep enough to reliably hit 2 cards, and that certainly means it's not that reliable to hit more than that. This is probably just a C-. Next up, it's Herkel Master Wizard, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is a 2/4 legendary human wizard advisor at rare. At the beginning of your end step, if you've cast a non-creature spell this turn, reveal the top 5 cards of your library. For each card type among non-creature spells you've cast this turn, you may put a card of that type from among the revealed cards into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This has a neat design, and it seems like she's going to draw you a card often enough to be pretty good. It's a bit of a bummer she doesn't count creatures, of course, as those are likely to be the most prevalent card type in your deck, but you also have a pretty good shot at hitting artifacts with her too, and in blue-red you have a pretty good shot at hitting instants or sorceries. She's probably going to draw you a card like half the time, and that's pretty strong. The times where you can draw multiple cards with her, which you can do if you cast like an instant, a sorcery, and an artifact in your turn and you get really lucky, those times are going to feel pretty good, but I wouldn't count on that happening that often. I'm giving her a B. Next up, it's Herkel's Final Meditation, which for 4 generic and 3 blue is a rare instant. As long as it's not your turn, this spell costs 3 more to cast. Return all non-land permanents to their owner's hands in the turn. Mass bounce cards usually disappoint in limited. Bouncing all non-land permanents just doesn't actually do what you want it to do most of the time. You spend a card and set yourself back. And yeah, you set your opponent back too, but it usually isn't by enough, especially because they will typically get to rebuild before you. The whole end of turn part of the card is sort of interesting, as it can functionally be a counterspell since it empties the stack and doesn't let spells resolve, and that's certainly some nice additional upside, as is the fact that you can cast this on your opponent's turn, which is where ending the turn can be the most powerful, but to do that you have to pay 10 mana. If you can do that, this basically functions like a Time Walk that bounces the whole board, which is pretty powerful, but that's just so much mana, and you can't use Power Stones for it. As cool as this card is, it's probably a D in limited. Next up, it's Involuntary Cooldown, which for 3 generic and a blue is an uncommon sorcery. It says tap up to 2 target artifacts and or creatures, put 2 stun counters on each of them. This makes the creatures you target with it tapped for 3 separate attacks on your part, and that's certainly pretty potent and can end a game. The downside is that it doesn't fully remove those cards, only temporarily getting them out of the way, and sometimes you'll still have static and activated abilities to worry about. You also need to have a board state that can really take advantage of the situation, or it just won't matter. Still, with a prowess deck in the format, this seems like a nice play in that type of deck. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Keeper of the Cadence, which for 4 generic and a blue is a 2/5 human wizard and uncommon. You can pay 3 generic to put target artifact, instant, or sorcery card from a graveyard on the bottom of its owner's library. This is a cool ability, and if you can find a way to mill yourself out, this can effectively let you choose what you draw every turn, and that's when this kind of thing is at its most powerful. Before you get to that point, though, you just have an overcosted creature whose ability won't be impacting the game for quite some time. Basically, in the most controlling deck ever, this is potentially a win condition, but that kind of deck doesn't often come together in limited. I think this is probably a D. Next up, it's Coilos Rock, which for 4 generic and a blue is a 3/3 bird at common. It's got flash and flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you create a tapped Power Stone token. These are artifact tokens that can tap to add colorless, but that mana can't be spent to cast a non-artifact spell. This is a nice common. A 5 mana 3/3 with flash and flying is usually a decent card, as it not only allows you to leave mana up for other stuff, you can flash it into ambush something, so I'm pretty interested in this adding a Power Stone token to the mix. Because of flash, you'll also be able to use that Power Stone most of the time as soon as you untap. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Latinum Adept, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 3/3 human wizard at common. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. 4 mana 3/3s feel pretty bad these days, but this one can grow throughout the game as you draw more cards, and that's the blue-black archetype, so this will certainly have a home in the format. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Machine Over Matter, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant. It says this spell costs 1 less to cast if you control an artifact creature. Return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. This seems solid, as it will often only cost a single blue mana, and the fact it can hit any non-land permanent makes it nicely flexible. Even if you do have to pay 2 for this, we've seen that card be fine in the past. The downside, of course, is you end up using a card, and generally you don't deal with one of your opponents. You just make them cast it again. But if you can time this right, you can sometimes get a 1-for-1 in addition to the tempo, like if you use it in response to a trick. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Mightstone's Animation, which for 3 generic and a blue is a common enchantment aura with Enchant Artifact. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. Enchanted Artifact is a creature with base power and toughness 4/4, in addition to its other types. This kind of effect can often be pretty underwhelming, but in a format with Power Stones everywhere, paying 4 mana to make a Power Stone into a 4/4 and draw a card is going to get pretty close to feeling like a 2-for-1. Now, a 4/4 isn't always relevant, of course, but you certainly made your Power Stone more relevant than it would have otherwise been, and that's why it's not sort of a full card upgrade, but it gets pretty close. You can also, in a pinch, put this on things that aren't Power Stones. You can even put it on an artifact that's already a creature if you just really need to draw a card, but the best thing to do with it is going to be to stick it on a Power Stone, draw a card, and really feel like you're adding to the board significantly. It's also a non-creature spell. It also draws you a card, so blue-red and blue-black are both happy about this, as are all of the Power Stone decks. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's One with the Multiverse, which for 6 generic and 2 blue is a mythic rare enchantment. You may look at the top card of your library anytime. You may play lands and cast spells from the top of your library. Once during each of your turns, you may cast a spell from your hand or the top of your library without paying its mana cost. Obviously, this is incredibly powerful. It will let you rip through your library and grant you absurd card advantage. It does cost 8 though, and you can't use Power Stones to cast this, so it doesn't get the boost that some other expensive cards get in this format. How good this is will come down to how possible it is to build a non-artifact focused ramp deck, and I'm pretty skeptical. My guess is that it's a mistake to think of this as something that will be easy to cast in most games, which really limits just how good it can be. It's the kind of card I'm going to take with a high pick early in the format to give it a try, but if I were really being responsible, I think I would take it significantly lower than that since it has some real problems. I'm going to start it at a C+. Next up, it's Retrieval Agent, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 2/5 human soldier at common. You can pay 2 generic and it gets +1/-1 until end of turn. This doesn't look very good to me. It has somewhat passable stats and a nice creature type, but the ability is expensive and underwhelming, even with Power Stones around. I'm giving this a C-. Next up, it's Scatter Ray, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant. It says counter target artifact or creature spell unless its controller pays 4. This looks like a solid counterspell for the format, as creatures and artifacts are going to make up the bulk of spells in most decks. It isn't a hard counter, but 4 mana is enough that it will be relevant most of the game. One downside in this format, Power Stones can be used to help pay for costs like this. Still, I think it's efficient enough to be a C+. Next up, it's Sky Strike Officer, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/3 human soldier at rare. It has flying. When it attacks, you create a 1/1 colorless soldier artifact creature token, and you can tap 3 untapped soldiers you control to draw a card. This is really good. It has a nice stat line, cranks out soldier tokens, and can even draw you cards. Obviously it makes soldiers on its own and is a soldier itself, but there are plenty of other soldiers in the set too. This can quickly get out of hand. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Splitting the Power Stone, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon sorcery. As an additional cost to cast it, sacrifice an artifact. Create 2 tapped Power Stone tokens. If the sacrificed artifact was legendary, draw a card. I don't love this. It's super clunky as a sorcery, especially because the Power Stones you get back enter tapped. And sure, sometimes you get to draw a card, but that's just rarely going to happen. They mostly went for a cool flavor win here with a legendary clause on the card, and this is certainly flavorful, but that clause just won't matter much in Limited. Giving up an artifact for 2 Power Stones just doesn't seem like I want to be doing most of the time, especially because you're also using up a card. You can combine it with Unearth or even just give up a Power Stone to do it, but none of that seems that great to me. I think this is a D. Next up, it's Stern Lesson, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common instant. Draw 2 cards and discard a card, create a tapped Power Stone token. This is a solid card that will slot nicely into the spell decks and the artifact decks, and the blue-black decks that want to draw multiple cards. 3 mana to draw 2 and discard 1 on its own is usually kind of okay, but I do think the Power Stone upside, plus the synergy it has with the set, is enough for this to be a one of in most blue decks in the format. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Take Flight, which for 3 generic and a blue is an uncommon enchantment aura with enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +1/+0 and has flying, and whenever this creature attacks, draw a card. This is quite the aura. +1/+0 when flying is going to make a lot of creatures problematic, and because you get to draw a card when that creature attacks, it helps you get around the dangerous 2-for-1 downside that's inherent with an aura. As long as your creature gets to attack, you're basically getting around it. If the creature then is allowed to continue unchecked, you're just going to win from the card advantage and the evasion. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Teferi Temporal Pilgrim, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a legendary Planeswalker Teferi at Mythic Rare. Starts with 4 loyalty. Whenever you draw a card, you put a loyalty counter on Teferi. He has a 0 ability, draw a card, a -2 loyalty ability that says, create a 2/2 blue spirit creature token with Vigilance, and whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. And he has an ultimate that is a -12, and it says target opponent chooses a permanent they control and returns it to its owner's hand. Then they shuffle each non-land permanent they control into its owner's library. So this is a bomb. The 0 ability is effectively a +1, and he also gains 1 loyalty every time you draw a card in general, so he's going to be able to gain loyalty pretty effectively, especially if you have some other draw effects. Meanwhile, his -2 creates a very real creature who does a great job of protecting him. If you just play Teferi and use the -2 twice, you're going to feel pretty good about it. Teferi will still be in play too, because you'll have drawn a card on every turn, and that's crazy because the creatures are also going to keep getting bigger. The ultimate probably isn't going to happen very often in Limited, but obviously if you do get there, it stands a pretty good chance of winning you the game since it takes away everything but a single non-land permanent. Next up, it's Third Path Savant, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/3 human wizard at common, and it can pay 7 generic mana to draw you 2 cards. A 3 mana 2/3 isn't very good these days, but this ability is obviously quite good. 7 mana is a lot, but you can use Power Stones to pay for it, which helps even that out. Drawing an extra 2 cards here and there is definitely the kind of thing that can help you get there. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Thopter Mechanic, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 human artificer at uncommon. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and when it dies, you create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. I'm already pretty much in on a 2 mana 2/1 that makes a Thopter token when it dies. That would be like a C+, so adding the card draw upside here is amazing. This is a great uncommon. I'm giving it a B. Next, it's Urza Power Stone Prodigy, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 1/3 legendary human artificer at uncommon. He's got Vigilance. You can pay 1 and tap him to draw a card and then discard a card. And whenever you discard 1 or more artifact cards, create a tapped Power Stone token. This ability triggers only once each turn. A 3 mana 1/3 with Vigilance that can loot is a card you would always play, so I love the upside you get when you discard artifacts. You won't always want to do that, of course, so I mostly see the ability as sort of softening the blow of having to discard a real card instead of a land when you loot, though discarding something with Unearth and stuff like that is pretty sweet, because you get the Power Stone and then you can unearth the thing as well. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Urza's Command, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a rare instant. It says choose 2. Creatures you don't control get -2/-0 until end of turn. Create a tapped Power Stone token. Create a tapped 0/0 colorless construct artifact creature token with. This creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact you control. Scry 1, then draw a card. Like most commands, this is going to be pretty good. You'll probably most frequently choose to make a creature token and scry 1 and draw a card, as obviously enough, both of those effects net you cards. And if that's what this always did, it would already be pretty good, but in addition to that, it allows you to do some other stuff too, although the other things are more situational. But sometimes debuffing your opponent's entire board at instant speed can really alter combat, and sometimes you need a Power Stone to ramp into. You can also grab the Power Stone when you make the construct token, and then you have an artifact in play to make it bigger. So yeah, I think this is quite good. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Urza's Rebuff, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is a common instant. It says choose one, counter target spell, tap up to 2 target creatures. Adding a second mode to cancel is an upgrade, and that's good because cancel is usually like a D+. 3 mana counter spells that cost 2 blue ask a little too much of you. That's a lot of mana to leave up, but it's nice. You can use this to tap stuff down too. That probably does enough to get it to a C-. Next up, it's Weakstone Subjugation, which for 1 blue is a common enchantment aura with enchant artifact or creature. When it enters the battlefield, you can pay 3 generic, and if you do, you tap Enchanted Permanent. Enchanted Permanent doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. This is a nice design, and I think it actually makes for a pretty good blue removal spell. Only paying 1 mana when the creature is already tapped feels pretty good, and then sort of kicking it to tap the creature down, too, and paying 4 mana is fine too. The creature can still do all kinds of stuff, unfortunately, like use abilities, be sacrificed, and so on. So I do think this falls short of premium, but it's a nice common. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Wing Commando, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 human soldier at common with flying and prowess. We've seen a 3 mana 2/2 flyer with prowess before, and it was really good, and I think this will be too. This will be a 3/3 a significant chunk of the time, and anytime you attack, your opponent has to consider the threat of activation, often making it very hard to block. This is probably blue's best common. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Zephyrs Sentinel, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 human soldier at uncommon. It's got flash and flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you can return up to 1 other target creature you control to its owner's hand. If it was a soldier, put a +1/+1 counter on Zephyrs Sentinel. So you would always play a 2 mana 2/1 with flying and flash. The additional effect here is a great thing to add. You can use it to save a creature from removal or to rebuy and enter the battlefield ability, and the soldier bonus is really nice too. But about half the time when you play this, you're just going to be flashing it in as a creature and not really using that effect. But the floor is really good, and then this can do some really silly stuff sometimes. I'm giving this a B. Alright, so those are technically all of the blue cards in Brothers War, but we also have artifacts to talk about that have a blue identity, like Arcane Proxy, which costs 7 generic mana for a 4/3 artifact creature wizard at Mythic Rare. When it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, exile target instant or sorcery card with mana value less than or equal to Arcane Proxy's power from your graveyard. Copy that card. You may cast the copy without paying its mana cost, but it also comes with Prototype, which means you can pay an alternate cost to have it come in as a card of that color and with a different size, but it keeps all its abilities and types. In this case, you can pay 1 generic and 2 blue to have it be a 2/1. So playing this for 3 and copying a cheap spell is going to be a good feeling, and it's very doable. Casting it the regular way obviously gives you even more options from the graveyard, though obviously it's a much bigger investment. I still feel like most of the time you're going to be getting a pretty sweet 2-for-1 if that's what you're doing. And 7 mana seems like a lot, but with Power Stones around, it's going to be a little easier than it looks. I do feel like this is a prototype creature where you kind of need to be able to cast it for the prototype version. And if you're always casting it for 7, it's going to be significantly worse, but you can probably get away with it even if you don't have blue mana. I think it's a B+. Next up, it's Coastal Bulwark, which for 2 generic is a 1/3 artifact creature wall at common. It's got Defender. It gets +2/+0 as long as you control an island, and you can pay 2 and tap it to surveil 1. This one's kind of interesting to see here. They gave it a blue set number, even though technically it doesn't have a blue identity because there's no blue mana symbol in the box. It does care about islands, obviously, but it is interesting in terms of set numbers that this is here. Anyway, obviously if you're playing blue, this is going to be a 2 mana 3/3 that can surveil 1, and that's like a solid thing to have around if you're a more defensive blue deck. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Combat Courier, which for 1 generic is a 1/1 artifact creature construct at common. You can pay 2 and sack it to draw a card, and you can unearth it for 1 blue mana, which means you can pay this cost, return it from your graveyard to the battlefield, it gains haste, exile it at the beginning of the next end step, or if it would leave the battlefield. Unearth only as a sorcery. It's nice that you can cash this in for a card twice, thanks to Unearth, and that does give you a 2-for-1, albeit an expensive one, but if you can get some extra value out of this being around, like triggers for an artifact entering the battlefield, or if you can get in for 1 damage with it, it's going to feel like a decent investment. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Depth Charge Colossus, which for 9 generic mana is an artifact creature Dreadnought at common. It's a 9/9, it doesn't untap during your untap step, and you have to pay 3 to untap it. It has Prototype for 4 generic and 2 blue, and if you do that, it's a 6/6. So most of the cards with Prototype in this format are pretty good. I don't really think this one is. Both modes are pretty inefficient for a creature that makes you pay mana just to untap it, and yes, Power Stones are a thing, but using your Power Stones just to untap this thing doesn't exactly seem like a good use of them. I'm giving this a D. Next up, it's Hulking Metamorph, which for 9 generic mana is a 7/7 artifact creature shapeshifter at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you can have it enter as a copy of an artifact or creature you control, except it's an artifact creature in addition to its other types, and its power and toughness are equal to Hulking Metamorph's power and toughness. And it has prototype for 2 generic and 2 blue, in which case it's a 3/3. A 4-mana 3/3 that can copy any creature or artifact you control is pretty good. It won't ever be worse than a 3/3, and that means it doesn't take that much in addition to that stat line for you to feel like you're getting a decent deal. Just copy something that has a keyword, static ability, or enter the battlefield ability, and you're going to feel great. The flip side, of course, is that if you have some really big creature, it won't be that good of a copy of it, but most big creatures have other stuff in the text box too, so that's okay. I also love the upside that you can play this late as a huge copy of something. This is a prototype where you pretty much have to have blue mana, or it's not really worth running though, because if you only have the 9 mana mode, that's pretty rough. I think this is a B. Next up, it's Spotter Thopter, which for 8 generic mana is an uncommon artifact creature Thopter. It's got flying, it's a 4/5, and when it enters the battlefield, you scry X, where X is its power. It has prototype for 3 generic and a blue, in which case it's a 2/3. So a 4-mana 2/3 that scries 2 is a C at the worst. Scrying 2, it's not quite drawing a card, but it does give you a significant advantage in terms of card quality. So the fact that in the late game you can also just power this out as an 8-mana 4/5 flyer, which is very relevant, and one that scries 4, that's pretty good. Especially because that 8-mana mode is more approachable than it seems. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Surge Engine, which for 2 generic mana is a 3/2 artifact creature construct at Mythic Rare. It's got Defender. You can pay 1 blue, and it loses Defender and gains this creature can't be blocked. And that is permanent. It's not an until end of turn thing. You can pay 2 generic and a blue, and it becomes blue and has base power and toughness 5/4. Activate only if Surge Engine doesn't have Defender. So you have to activate the first one, then this one. And then the last ability is 4 generic and 2 blue, draw 3 cards, activate only if Surge Engine is blue and only once. This looks really good to me. It's a 2-drop that has to be answered by your opponent or they lose. You can basically make this an unblockable 3-mana 3/2, and that's a card that's really good and limited, but it's even better than that because you can pay that 3 mana in 2 separate installments, and then it also has other abilities. It can become a 5/4 that ends the game even more quickly, and if it's not doing enough on its own for some reason, you can just draw a bunch of cards with it. This is a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's the Temporal Anchor, which for 3 generic and 3 blue is a rare legendary artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, scry 2. Whenever you choose to put 1 or more cards on the bottom of your library while scrying, exile that many cards from the bottom of your library. During your turn, you may play cards exiled with the Temporal Anchor. So you have to pay 6 for this and spend a turn not adding to the board, and then you have to wait a whole turn to get it going. But it effectively draws you 2 extra cards every turn, which is of course absolutely absurd. You'll just scry 2 cards to the bottom of the library with this basically every time, since you effectively draw 2 when you do that. It can even get sillier if you have more scry around, and there is scry around in blue as we've seen. It's going to be pretty hard for you to lose the game if you make it to your next turn after casting this. Having to wait for that whole turn does hurt, but I think the upside here is so incredible that it's going to be worth it. It's an artifact too, so you can use Power Stones to cast it, though it's not going to help you get that 3 blue, which can sometimes be a challenge in Limited. I think this does enough to be a bomb, even with the downside of it not doing anything for a whole turn. I'm giving it an A-. And our last card for this video is Teresian Mindbreaker, which for 7 generic mana is a 6/4 artifact creature Juggernaut at rare. When it attacks, defending player mills half of their library, rounded up, and it has Unearth for 1 generic and 3 blue. So here's the mill card in the format that people will undoubtedly overrate. Milling just isn't a viable strategy in most limited formats. It happens sometimes, but I don't think it's happening very often if this is your way of doing it. Hitting half of an opponent's library with every attack is definitely sweet, and even if your opponent kills it, you can unearth it. And all of that's fine, but it isn't really going to mill your opponent out all that often. When you're only milling half of a library, it also means you can basically never mill the entire library. Your opponent has to draw cards too, and they will, but the number of attacks and things that you really have to get going here basically would just kill your opponent anyway. Now, it's better than a lot of pure mill cards because at least it's a creature and the unearth cost is actually kind of efficient, but it's probably just a C. It's a big artifact creature that can mill. Another downside is there are several decks in the format that will actually like it when you mill them, and that's certainly a problem too. So those are all the blue cards in the Brothers' War. Tomorrow I'll be back to talk about all the black cards. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this review, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on the parts of the review that are already out, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.